The unseen power. The airport was a maze of movement, a place where time stretched and contracted with the pulse of arrivals and departures. Travelers hurried, their heads down as they navigated through the terminals, while announcements echoed overhead, urging passengers to be on the lookout for their gates or to hurry to avoid missing flights. It was an environment of subtle urgency, a hum of energy that reverberated through every corner. Raven Moore stood at the first-class check-in counter, her leather suitcase resting beside her. It was not one of those high-end luxury bags often seen flaunted by the elite. It was a simple, practical bag, its worn edges betraying years of travel. There was a history in that bag, every scuff and mark on the leather told a story. Raven liked it that way. She wasn't here to impress anyone, she was here to get to her destination, just like everyone else. Her attire was far from what one might expect of a top-tier executive. She wore dark, well-fitted jeans and a blouse that was both comfortable and stylish, layered beneath a light gray jacket. Her look was understated, blending in with the crowd rather than standing out. There was power in her anonymity. She didn't need to wear the trappings of her position, she had long ago learned that true influence didn't come from what you wore, but from how you carried yourself. As she waited in line, her sharp eyes scanned the surrounding scene. Travelers hustled past, some in a rush, some lost in their own world, while others seemed completely unaware of the tension that underpinned every moment of the travel experience. Raven had spent years in high-stakes business meetings and boardrooms, but this was different. Here, there was a different kind of power at play. The kind that didn't care about your title or what you could offer. The kind that judged you on the surface, on your appearance, and on the assumptions made before you ever opened your mouth. At the counter, Maria, the check-in supervisor, seemed to be running the show. With a name badge that was positioned precisely over her chest, she exuded an air of practiced authority. Her movements were efficient, though somewhat robotic, as she checked in passengers with mechanical ease. But Raven could sense something else beneath the surface, a certain superiority, perhaps. The way Maria's eyes flicked over some passengers with barely concealed disdain, her clipped responses to those she deemed unworthy of her time. Behind Maria, Josh, her younger colleague, stood leaning lazily against the counter. He looked almost too comfortable in his role, tapping away at his phone with the ease of someone who had grown bored with the monotony of their job. From the way he interacted with the passengers, it was clear he was more interested in his own little world than in offering genuine service. But it was the dynamic between the two that caught Raven's attention. Maria and Josh shared a silent exchange of glances, the kind of look that seemed to say everything without a word. Raven couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt it, the sense that some people were allowed to pass through with ease, while others, like her, were being judged, evaluated, and potentially dismissed based on factors that had nothing to do with their actual worth. She had experienced this before, many times, but it still managed to spark something inside her, a quiet frustration that threatened to rise. As the line moved forward, the next passenger in line, a sharply dressed businessman, stepped up to the counter. His suit, impeccably tailored, drew a smile from Maria that could only be described as sugary sweet. Raven watched as their exchange unfolded, fast, efficient, and laced with unnecessary pleasantries. The businessman was treated with a courtesy that Raven had yet to receive, and she noted the difference in how Maria addressed him. She was polite, yes, but there was something about the way her smile seemed to deepen, the way her voice became just a bit more syrupy, that made it clear this was someone who was deserving of her full attention. Raven's fingers tightened around the handle of her suitcase as she waited for her turn. She didn't begrudge the businessman his place in the world, he had worked hard for it, no doubt, but the stark contrast between how he was treated and how she was about to be treated gnawed at her. She had seen this pattern too many times in her life, the subtle, unspoken preference for certain people, based on assumptions and biases. But she wasn't going to be intimidated. She didn't need to prove her worth to anyone. When her turn finally came, Raven took a breath and walked confidently toward the counter. Maria looked up briefly, her eyes scanning Raven's appearance with a sharpness that felt almost calculating. There was a moment of hesitation, then Maria's fingers brushed over the keyboard with a speed that made Raven wonder if she had already decided how this encounter was going to go. "May I see your ticket, please?" Maria asked, her voice devoid of warmth. Raven handed over her boarding pass, but Maria didn't immediately check it. Instead, her eyes flicked back to Raven's face as if searching for something that would confirm or deny the assumptions she had already made. Raven held her gaze, her face calm and neutral, refusing to let any unease show. "First class?" Maria's voice was tinged with disbelief. The words, though polite on the surface, carried an edge. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, as though she found it difficult to reconcile the appearance of this woman in front of her with the idea that she belonged in first class. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" she asked, her tone clipped. Raven's lips parted, but she closed them again. There was no need to argue. She had encountered this kind of behavior before. Staff who assumed they could dismiss her based on her attire, her skin, or the way she carried herself. The assumption that she didn't belong here. And it hurt, even now, after all these years of navigating the corporate world and breaking down barriers. But this time, Raven wasn't going to let it slide. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "It's mine. Is there a problem with it?" Maria hesitated again, then glanced at Josh, who had finally looked up from his phone. The two exchanged a brief, unspoken glance. It was clear they were trying to determine how best to handle her. The moment stretched out, awkward and heavy. Josh finally chimed in, his tone almost condescending. "We just need to verify some details," he said, looking Raven up and down with a strange look in his eyes. "Please wait over there." Raven's pulse quickened, but she didn't show it. She gave a small nod, refusing to let them see how much their behavior had stung. She knew she could make a scene, but she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. Instead, she turned and walked to the small seating area across the terminal, her back straight, her movements deliberate. The other passengers were too wrapped up in their own worlds to pay much attention, but Raven felt the weight of their eyes as she passed. Some glanced at her curiously, others with suspicion. She was used to it by now, the subtle judgment based on her appearance. But that didn't mean it didn't sting. She took a seat in the corner, her thoughts racing. She could feel the humiliation rising, but she pushed it back. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles to let something like this, an assumption based solely on the way she looked, define her. She wasn't just some random traveler. She was Raven Moore, and she belonged wherever she wanted to be. As the minutes ticked by, Raven did something she hadn't done in years. She allowed herself a brief moment to relax. Her hands, which had been clenched around the suitcase handle, loosened. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the sounds around her, the hum of the terminal, the distant chatter of other travelers. There was a steady rhythm to it all, a rhythm that mirrored the quiet pulse of her own determination. She wasn't going to let this pass. A few more minutes passed before Maria returned, but this time, her demeanor had changed. Raven opened her eyes and met the woman's gaze. Something had shifted, and Raven wasn't sure if it was Maria's discomfort with the situation or the subtle hint of recognition that had started to creep into her expression. Whatever it was, Raven knew that the balance of power was about to shift. Raven stood up slowly, her gaze unwavering. It was time for the tables to turn. And they would dot a shift in power. Raven had always been a woman who thrived on control. In her world, there were no accidents, no moments of fate where circumstances spun wildly out of control. Every decision was calculated, every move deliberate. But what she had learned over the years was that sometimes, the unexpected was the most powerful force of all. And now, as the minutes stretched on and the staff behind the counter continued to fumble over her boarding pass, she realized that today was one of those moments. She stood there, watching the staff work behind the counter, her eyes sharp and focused. Her body was calm, almost unnervingly so. No one could guess the storm raging within her. As she waited, the silence between them hung heavy in the air. The slight murmurs of passengers around her seemed to fade, leaving only the tension of the moment. Maria had returned to the counter and was speaking with Josh in hushed tones. Raven noticed the way they spoke in quick, clipped phrases, their eyes flicking toward her occasionally. They were discussing something, no doubt her. She didn't need to be a mind reader to know that the two were debating how to handle her. Should they apologize and let her pass, or continue with their assumption that she didn't belong? Raven's heart began to steady. She wasn't sure what exactly had changed in her, but a quiet resolve began to settle within her. Perhaps it was the indignity of being judged without merit, or perhaps it was simply that she was tired of allowing others to make decisions for her. Whatever it was, something inside her began to shift, like a cog turning into place. The faint hum of the terminal, the sound of distant announcements over the PA, all of it faded away as she locked eyes with Maria. The check-in supervisor was now looking at her directly, her expression a mixture of confusion and perhaps a hint of guilt. Maria glanced nervously at the ticket again, flipping it over as though she could find some hidden flaw that hadn't yet been revealed. Her fingers shook slightly as they hovered over the keyboard. "Miss Moore," Maria finally spoke, her voice tight. It was the first time she had addressed her by name. "We've just done a thorough verification of your information, and it seems that there's no issue with your ticket after all." Raven stood up straighter, her spine taut like a wire. She could feel the weight of the moment, the decision she had made to not let them make her feel small, to not allow herself to become another victim of misplaced assumptions. It wasn't about the flight anymore. It wasn't even about the inconvenience of the delay. It was about something larger, something that had been building inside her for years. She was tired of being underestimated. "I'm glad to hear that," Raven said smoothly, her voice calm and collected. "Now, I'm assuming there's no more confusion?" Maria blinked, the question clearly catching her off guard. She was used to playing the role of the one who held the power in these interactions, but now she was suddenly on the back foot. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to do next. Raven took a step closer, her presence now dominating the counter. She was no longer the passive figure who had been scrutinized and dismissed. She was the one in control. "You don't seem to be the type who likes to admit mistakes," Raven continued, her tone still even but laced with quiet authority. "But here's the thing, you made one. You assumed, based on my appearance, that I didn't belong in first class. You made a judgment call without knowing a single thing about me." Maria swallowed, her face flushing. Raven could see that the supervisor was struggling with her response, trying to keep her professional mask intact, but the cracks were beginning to show. Josh, who had been lazily observing the entire interaction, shifted uncomfortably behind the counter. He was beginning to realize that this situation was no longer something they could simply brush aside. "I didn't," Maria began, but her words faltered. "No, you didn't," Raven interjected. "But you did make an assumption, and now we're both going to deal with the fallout from that." Raven paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to settle between them. "I'm not here to make a scene. I don't need to. What I need, however, is for you to understand one thing: people like me don't come with a warning. You can't judge us based on our clothes or our appearance, and you sure as hell can't treat us like second-class citizens. Because trust me, Maria, I'm not second to anyone." There was a long pause as the words hung in the air. For the first time, Maria's composure began to crack. She shifted on her feet, her gaze flickering between Raven and the terminal, as though seeking some escape from the inevitable fallout of her actions. I understand," Maria stammered, her voice faltering. "I apologize for the inconvenience. I'll make sure your check-in process goes smoothly from here on." Raven took a step back, her expression unreadable. She nodded slightly, but the conversation wasn't over yet. She had seen enough to know that apologizing now wasn't enough. It was the quiet realization that would have the most lasting impact, the realization that she wasn't someone to be pushed aside or ignored. Raven had always been someone who preferred to lead, to keep things moving forward, but she was also someone who understood the power of timing. She glanced at Josh, who had been standing by silently through the exchange. He shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, and she could see that he too had realized that the power dynamic had flipped. He was no longer in charge of the situation. No, that position now belonged to her. Without another word, Raven reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She unlocked it and dialed a number she knew all too well. The phone rang once, twice, and then the voice on the other end picked up. Mr. Thompson, Raven's voice was steady, calm. I need a favor. If you could have a quick word with the CEO of this airline about something that's come to my attention. No need to make it formal. I'll handle the rest. There was a brief pause, and then Mr. Thompson's voice came through the phone, clear and accommodating. Of course, Raven. I'll make sure it's taken care of immediately. Anything else? Raven didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced back at Maria and Josh, who had both been watching her, their expressions a mixture of uncertainty and realization. She could sense their discomfort, and for the first time in a long while, Raven allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. No, she finally said, her voice cool. That will be all. Just ensure the CEO knows that the new CEO of this company has arrived, and she's not going to forget this encounter anytime soon. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her bag with an ease that only someone used to the weight of such moments could manage. Without looking back, Raven turned toward the gate, her steps slow but deliberate. She could feel the stares of the other passengers now. They had witnessed the scene unfold, and they could see the shift in power. Raven didn't care what they thought. What mattered now was that the tables had turned. And she was on top. The unraveling. As Raven walked toward the gate, a quiet satisfaction settled over her. The airport, with all its hurried bustle and cold efficiency, had become an arena, and she had just won the first round. The usual din of footsteps and announcements faded into the background as she processed everything that had happened in those few short minutes. She knew the game was far from over. What had started as an act of frustration, a simple moment of being underestimated, was now turning into something much larger. Behind her, Maria and Josh exchanged glances. They hadn't expected this. No one had. But Raven was not just another businesswoman or ordinary traveler. She was an executive with a sharp mind, an iron will, and a deep understanding of how to navigate power. The truth was, the moment Raven had walked up to that counter, she had already known how the interaction would unfold. And despite everything, she was still willing to let the system play itself out. But now that she'd set the wheels in motion, she wasn't going to let up until she had a resolution, one that was entirely in her favor. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the faint vibration pulling her back into the present. It was Mr. Thompson. She had already known he'd take care of the situation, but hearing from him directly made her pulse quicken slightly. Raven, his voice crackled through, calm and composed. I've spoken with the airline's CEO. They're aware of your situation. He's quite surprised by the way things were handled. I've also informed him about the personal request you made. Raven's lips curled into a subtle smile as she continued walking toward the gate, her footsteps deliberate and steady. She could feel the eyes of other passengers watching her, but it didn't matter. She didn't seek their validation. No, the ones who would soon be watching her the closest were the ones who would regret this entire encounter. Thank you, Mr. Thompson, Raven said, her voice firm. Let's make sure they're all properly informed about the new leadership structure. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a chuckle from Thompson. Understood. It'll be a pleasure to ensure that. You've got a way of making an impression. Raven allowed herself a moment to bask in the satisfaction of his words. She had always prided herself on making an impact. Whether it was through her company's impressive portfolio or her ability to change the game in any room she walked into, Raven knew how to make her presence known. But this was something else entirely. She ended the call and made her way toward the gate. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. The interaction with Maria and Josh had been the first spark, but it wasn't enough for Raven. She had been wronged, and she wasn't about to let it go with a simple apology. No, this was a matter of principle. She didn't need to humiliate them in public, but she would ensure that their behavior became a lesson, one that would linger long after she was gone. Raven arrived at the gate where a few early travelers were already milling about. She gave a brief, courteous nod to the gate agent who greeted her with a smile, still unaware of what had unfolded just moments before. The staff was distracted, engaged in quiet chatter, and Raven took a deep breath, scanning her surroundings. The people in this terminal would never know the full story, and that was fine. But she would make sure that Maria, Josh, and the others involved would. A thought crossed her mind, a fleeting but powerful impulse that made her pause for a moment. She looked around and spotted a small group of businessmen gathered at a nearby cafe, casually discussing the latest market trends. They didn't seem to take notice of her, but Raven had always been keenly aware of the power of perception. She knew exactly how to play the game. Without saying a word, she pulled her phone back out and sent a quick text to her assistant, James. "Get me the numbers for the airline's internal staff. I'll be needing a few key people in HR for a meeting as soon as I land. Make sure everything is in order." Within seconds, the reply came through. "On it, Ms. Moore." James was always quick to respond, always prepared. That's why she kept him by her side. Raven let her phone slip back into her bag, her mind whirring as she continued to watch the other passengers. In her line of work, she had learned that no situation was ever truly simple. Everything had layers, every decision had consequences. And as she stood there, just a few feet away from where the airline staff had dismissed her, she realized that today's confrontation wasn't just about a misplaced assumption. It was about setting the stage for something larger, a shift in the way people perceived her. It wasn't enough to simply be a successful executive, she needed to be respected, feared, and yes, even admired. And what better way to instill that respect than through actions? Not through words or posturing, but through the impact of her decisions. She wasn't here to fit in. She was here to change the narrative. Raven's attention drifted back to the gate as the gate agent finally called her name, signaling the start of her boarding process. The moment felt almost anticlimactic. Here she was, about to board a routine flight, yet in the back of her mind, the game was still very much alive. As she stepped forward, the airline staff who had dismissed her before looked up. Maria and Josh exchanged glances, their faces stricken with the weight of what was about to happen. They had no idea yet, but their world was about to change. Raven could feel the subtle shift in the air, the realization that they were no longer in control of this narrative. Their previous dismissal of her had set into motion an avalanche of consequences they wouldn't be able to escape from. No longer just a passenger, Raven Moore was about to redefine her relationship with this airline, and her own professional destiny. When the gate agent handed her the boarding pass, Raven made sure to make direct eye contact with both Maria and Josh. Her gaze was calm but unwavering, the slightest hint of authority emanating from her presence. It was no longer about getting on a flight, it was about ensuring they understood one thing: she didn't need to fight for respect. She commanded it. With a smooth motion, Raven took the boarding pass and turned on her heel, walking confidently toward the plane. The terminal was still bustling, but for Raven, the world had quieted down to a hum of anticipation. This was far from over. The next part of the journey was just beginning, the long road ahead. Raven's flight was uneventful, but the moment she set foot on the plane, a sense of foreboding settled over her. It wasn't that the journey itself was anything unusual. She'd flown countless times before, and this was just another plane ride to another destination. But her mind buzzed with the endless possibilities of what she had just set into motion. Raven wasn't a woman who merely thought in terms of immediate victories, she always looked ahead, planning her next move. She settled into her first-class seat, a place she had earned many times over through years of hard work, both in the boardroom and in the back corridors of power. The seat was plush and comfortable, but it felt distant to her now. The comfort she once felt in these spaces, surrounded by luxury, had become less about the amenities and more about the weight of her own influence. In the silence of the plane cabin, her thoughts raced forward. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her assistant, James. The internal team is already compiling the list of people to meet with when you land. HR and legal are ready. Just need your confirmation on whether you want to handle the press release today. Raven's fingers hovered over the screen as she read the message. Press releases were a tricky thing. On one hand, they could build the right narrative, one that reflected her control, her power. On the other hand, they could be too much, too soon. She didn't want to rush this. The announcement of her new role in the airline could wait for a few more days. She needed to create the perfect moment, the right timing when the world would have no choice but to sit up and take notice. Hold off on the press for now. We'll do it at the right moment, she typed back, then added, and make sure everyone involved is briefed. I don't want any leaks. With that, she put the phone down and leaned back in her seat, glancing out the window. The plane had begun to taxi down the runway, the engines roaring to life, a comforting hum that seemed to reflect her own inner rhythm. Raven had always found peace in movement, in the way a journey could clear the mind. Yet, this flight wasn't just about the destination, it was about what was happening at that very moment, the ripple effect she was setting in motion that would eventually reach far beyond the confines of this airplane. She thought back to the encounter at the airport. Maria and Josh, the way they had looked at her with that mix of confusion and discomfort, would stay with her. The way she had risen above their dismissal, made them understand just how far-reaching the consequences of their judgment could be, had been cathartic. But she wasn't finished. No, Raven was only just beginning to weave the tapestry that would shape her future. She glanced around the cabin. The other passengers in first class were engrossed in their own worlds, some buried in laptops, others chatting with each other, completely unaware of the woman they were sharing space with. Raven could feel the subtle pull of the world outside the aircraft, and it made her realize something important. The moment she stepped off this plane, everything was going to change. The people in this cabin, the passengers she would never see again, would have no idea how monumental the day had been. The same could be said for the staff at the airport. Her mind flicked to the airline's higher-ups, the CEO, in particular. She had known him for years, not personally, but enough to understand how he thought. He was the type of person who liked to have his hands in everything, always present, always aware. But Raven had learned long ago that real power didn't come from being involved in every little detail, it came from knowing when to step back and let things unfold on their own. That was how she played the game. A few hours later, the plane began its descent. Raven felt her pulse quicken as the city below came into view. She could feel the energy of the ground beneath her feet calling her. Every time she returned to her city, it felt like a renewal. But this time, the feeling was different, charged, almost electric. She had a mission now. There was something bigger on the horizon, and she was ready to make it her own. The plane landed, and Raven followed the standard procedures for disembarking. The airport was far busier than it had been earlier. The hum of activity was louder, more frantic, as people rushed to their destinations, unaware that their world was about to shift. Raven didn't rush, however. She moved through the terminal with a quiet, commanding presence. Her first-class privileges allowed her to bypass the usual lines, and she walked with deliberate, unhurried steps toward baggage claim. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from her HR manager. All team members involved in today's decisions are on standby. We've prepared everything for a quick transition, including your office and security. Raven's lips curled into a faint smile. She had made sure to put the right people in place long before this moment. She knew that transitions could be delicate, especially when the power dynamic shifted so suddenly, but she wasn't afraid of discomfort. In fact, she thrived on it. A few uncomfortable moments here and there, a few raised eyebrows, it was all part of the game. As she approached the baggage claim area, she saw a group of staff members, including Maria and Josh, standing by, looking visibly unsettled. Raven couldn't help but feel a brief flicker of satisfaction. They had no idea what was about to hit them. She walked past them, making sure to make eye contact with each of them in turn, her gaze steady, unwavering. Maria was the first to break the silence. "Ms. Moore," she said, her voice soft but clearly trying to mask the nervousness behind her words. "I hope your flight was comfortable." Raven turned slowly, giving her the full weight of her attention. "Yes, Maria, it was. But I think it's time we had a real conversation about what happened earlier." Josh shifted uncomfortably behind Maria, his face flushed with embarrassment. Raven could see that both of them were trying to figure out how to handle this situation. She could almost see the gears turning in their minds, trying to assess the damage, trying to figure out what she would say next. "What happened earlier was a lesson," Raven continued, her voice cool but firm. "A lesson in humility. You assumed that just because I wasn't in a suit or carrying a briefcase, I didn't belong in first class. You let your bias cloud your judgment, and now you have to live with the consequences." Maria nodded silently, her face still flushed. Raven could see the regret in her eyes, but it wasn't enough. The damage had been done. And Raven would ensure that it would never happen again, not just to her but to anyone else who might be treated with the same disdain. She took a deep breath, ready to make her move. "I'm not here to make you uncomfortable, Maria," she said, her tone almost sympathetic now. "But I will make sure this company understands the value of every customer. And I will ensure that those who disregard that value are held accountable." Raven turned and continued walking toward her waiting car, her movement steady and confident. Behind her, she could hear the faint murmur of conversations beginning to bubble up, the realization spreading through the staff that something monumental had just shifted. They had no idea what Raven's next move would be, but they were about to find out. Raven slid into the back of her car, her phone buzzing once more. She glanced down and smiled slightly. "All set, Ms. Moore. The transition is in motion." As the car pulled out of the airport, Raven watched the lights of the city pass by. She knew the hardest part was still ahead, but she was ready. The world had been given a glimpse of who she was, but now it was time for them to see the full picture. Raven Moore was no longer just a passenger on a flight, she was the one in control of the journey. The reckoning. The city spread out before Raven like a canvas, a place where the threads of power and influence intertwined in ways that only those who had spent years navigating the system truly understood. The hum of traffic, the flow of people going about their business, the towering buildings, they were all part of the grand design, a testament to what could be built when vision, perseverance, and a little bit of luck converged in the right place at the right time. Raven had built her empire in the shadows of these streets, using the city's pulse as her guide, but today was different. Today, she was standing in the heart of it all, ready to reshape the narrative. Her driver pulled into the underground garage of the building where her company's headquarters was located. The sleek black car came to a smooth stop, the hum of the engine dying down as Raven slid out of the vehicle. She didn't bother with the usual small talk, the driver knew better than to speak. Raven was already lost in thought, thinking about the next move, the next step in her grand plan. Inside the building, her assistant, James, was waiting for her in the lobby. He was dressed in his usual sharp suit, his demeanor calm but alert. He greeted her with a nod, acknowledging the weight of the moment without needing to say a word. Raven didn't need small pleasantries. She had no time for them now. "The transition is set," James said, as he escorted her into the elevator. "HR, legal, and the board have been briefed. Everyone's ready for the meeting. They'll be expecting you in 30 minutes. Raven gave him a brief nod. "Good. Make sure that everyone in the room knows what's at stake today. This isn't just about protocol. It's about setting a precedent. We're not here to make friends, we're here to send a message." James looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly, a silent understanding passing between them. He had been with Raven long enough to know that her decisions were rarely about personal satisfaction. They were about reshaping the world around her, about taking what was hers and turning it into something unassailable. The elevator doors opened to the 42nd floor, and Raven stepped out into the sleek, modern office space. The building buzzed with the quiet hum of productivity, employees moving with purpose behind their desks, unaware of the seismic shifts taking place just a few floors above them. Raven didn't need them to know, not yet. The people who needed to be in the know were already in the boardroom. James led her down the long corridor, past the various offices and meeting rooms, until they reached the large glass doors that marked the entrance to the boardroom. A few members of the leadership team were already there, including some key figures from HR and legal. The room was silent, each person aware of the gravity of the situation, but none willing to speak until Raven made her entrance. Raven pushed open the doors with a confident stride, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. The murmurs quieted as the door shut behind her, and all eyes turned toward her. She stood tall, her posture impeccable, a sharp contrast to the casual attire she had worn to the airport just hours earlier. The people in this room, the ones who had never questioned her before, now had to face the truth that they were dealing with someone who could dismantle their complacency with a single decision. "Good afternoon," Raven began, her voice steady and clear. "I trust everyone is aware of the reason we're gathered here today." The CEO, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a tired look in his eyes, cleared his throat and leaned forward in his seat. "Yes, Raven," he said, his voice tentative, as though he were treading carefully around something he didn't fully understand. "We've reviewed the situation with the airline, and we understand the concerns raised regarding your interaction with staff. However, I believe we should approach this with some level of—" Raven raised a hand, silencing him. The room fell into an uncomfortable quiet, the kind that made even the most seasoned executives uneasy. She looked at him directly, her eyes unwavering. "I'm not here for a discussion, Greg," she said coldly. "I'm here to ensure that this company understands what happens when employees overstep. Maria and Josh may have been the ones who humiliated me in public, but they were merely the first in a long line of failures." Greg's face shifted from confusion to something closer to defensiveness. "I don't think we need to go this far, Raven. You're one of us. We're a family here." "Family?" Raven repeated, her tone icy. "You think because we work together, because we've built something successful together, that I'm just another part of the system? I'm not family, Greg. I'm your CEO. And it's time for this company to understand that." Her words were sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. The rest of the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging wary glances. They had all known Raven as a sharp, capable executive, but this was different. There was something deeper in her tone, something that demanded respect without even asking for it. "Here's the reality," Raven continued, her voice unwavering. "We've built an empire. But empires crumble when they're not led by those who understand the value of every person involved. Every employee. Every customer. And when we treat people, any people, like they're beneath us, we're making a dangerous mistake." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The HR manager, a middle-aged woman named Carla, cleared her throat. Raven, with all due respect, we can handle disciplinary action for the employees involved. But... No, Raven interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. This is bigger than Maria and Josh. This is about a culture of complacency that has seeped into this company. I will not tolerate it. And I won't allow it to fester under my leadership. She turned to the legal team, who had remained quiet until now. I want a full review of our policies and procedures. I want to ensure that every staff member from top to bottom knows that discrimination and disrespect have no place here. If you're not willing to make these changes, then you won't be part of the new vision for this company. The legal team members exchanged nervous glances, and Carla spoke up again. Raven, this is a huge shift. It's going to require a complete overhaul in some areas. Raven nodded slowly. Yes, and it's necessary. I don't care how difficult it is. Change is always difficult. But it's also necessary. And it's not just about these employees. It's about setting a standard. A standard that says, if you want to be part of this company, you have to respect everyone. No exceptions. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle in. It was a quiet room now, the silence heavy with the realization that the ground beneath them was shifting. Raven's gaze swept across the room, making sure everyone understood. We will be launching a full internal audit within the next 48 hours, she added. Everyone involved in decision-making will be thoroughly evaluated. Any past incidents of discrimination or misconduct will be addressed, and I expect each of you to be fully transparent in this process. No one is exempt. The CEO, still clearly unsettled, sat back in his chair and rubbed his temples. He opened his mouth to speak, but Raven held up a hand once more. I know you're all uncomfortable right now, she said, her voice low but powerful. But let me make one thing clear, if you want to stay in this company, if you want to stay in your positions, you will adapt. You will follow the new direction. And you will respect the people who make this company what it is. Raven let the silence stretch on for a moment, allowing the full impact of her words to sink in. Then, with a final look at the room, she nodded decisively. I'll be in touch, she said, turning on her heel and heading for the door. As the door clicked shut behind her, the tension in the room broke. It was clear now, the future of the company, and perhaps even the industry, was no longer in the hands of those who had grown comfortable. Raven Moore had arrived, and she wasn't just changing policies, she was changing the very culture of an empire. The reckoning had begun. The aftermath. The following days unfolded like a ripple on the surface of a calm sea, the consequences of Raven's actions reverberating through every layer of the organization. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon on the fourth evening after her boardroom confrontation, the company she had once known from the inside was irrevocably changed. The shift was undeniable. A transformation had begun, not in the abstract sense of corporate jargon or mission statements, but in the raw, undeniable experience of the people who made the company what it was. Employees were talking, systems were being questioned, and the foundations Raven had set were now shifting in ways that would echo far beyond the walls of the headquarters. Raven had not been surprised by the resistance, but she had underestimated the degree to which it would present itself. It came not in the form of open rebellion, but in the quiet, subtle resistance of those who found the sudden shift in power disorienting. Her first few days had been consumed with meetings, both with her internal team and with a select group of trusted advisors from outside the company, individuals who were carefully chosen to provide the strategic depth and perspective necessary to carry out the massive restructuring that she had mandated. There were old-school executives who fidgeted during meetings, glancing at their phones with increasing discomfort when Raven spoke. But Raven had anticipated this. She had already made it clear that complacency and corporate politics would no longer have a place in her new regime. One afternoon, as Raven sat in her office reviewing the latest round of reports, she received a call from Carla, the head of HR. Carla's voice, usually confident and crisp, was uncharacteristically soft. "Raven," she said, "I've just finished going through the personnel files of several senior leaders, as you requested. There are discrepancies. Serious ones. Some employees have been promoted based on favoritism, others have been passing over minority candidates for years, and there are whispers about favoritism towards certain groups. I'll need more time to go through the entire roster, but it's clear there's a culture of favoritism we need to uproot." Raven exhaled slowly, a quiet sense of vindication filling her. She had known this would be the case. Her company, like so many others, had been blind to its own biases, operating under the illusion that success could be measured solely by the numbers on a balance sheet. That had never been her vision. She had always believed that true success, sustainable growth, could only be built on a foundation of respect and equity. "Take your time, Carla," Raven said, her voice calm but firm. "But don't let this slide. If there's one thing I cannot and will not tolerate, it's complacency in leadership. I want actionable change, and I want it now." As she hung up, Raven felt a surge of purpose. She had seen it before, the slow, insidious creep of favoritism, how it could poison an organization from the inside out. But this was more than that. This was about reshaping the very core of how the company operated. It was about giving every employee, regardless of background or position, the opportunity to thrive. She wasn't just executing a corporate overhaul. She was waging a battle for dignity and respect in the workplace. That evening, as Raven prepared to leave the office, James entered, his usually composed demeanor slightly strained. "Raven, there's something you need to know," he said, closing the door behind him. "I've been hearing whispers from a few senior figures. Some of them are questioning whether your methods are too aggressive. They're concerned about the pace of change." Raven met his gaze, the intensity of her focus unwavering. "What do you think?" she asked simply. James hesitated for a moment before answering. "I think you're doing the right thing. But you're making waves, Raven. Some of these people have been in positions of power for decades. They're not used to someone like you coming in and tearing down the old guard." Raven smiled slightly, leaning back in her chair. "That's the point, James. They don't get to decide how things go anymore. We do. And I'm not here to play nice. I'm here to set things right." There was a brief silence before James spoke again, a note of admiration in his voice. "You've always known what you wanted. And you're going to get it." Raven's smile faded into something more resolute. "I'm going to do more than get it, James. I'm going to make sure this company is never the same again." The following week, Raven found herself back at the airport where it all began. This time, however, there were no lines, no dismissive staff, no uncomfortable moments of being overlooked. This time, Raven was there to ensure that the message she had started would be heard loud and clear. As she walked through the terminal, she couldn't help but notice the changes in the air, subtle, perhaps, but unmistakable. There were fewer glances of disinterest from employees, fewer moments of condescending tones or dismissive gestures. It was as if, without saying a word, the staff had already begun to understand that the game had changed. She entered a private conference room with the new senior leadership team she had put in place. The room was filled with individuals who shared her vision, a vision where power wasn't defined by position but by merit and respect for others. Raven didn't need to give a speech. The change was already happening. One of the new executives, a woman named Tanya, spoke up first, her tone calm but confident. "Raven, I've seen the shift in the office. Employees are beginning to feel more empowered. They're not just following orders anymore. They're speaking up. But there's still resistance. Some of the old guard is clinging to their outdated methods." Raven nodded, absorbing the information. That's to be expected. Change is always uncomfortable. But the resistance will subside. The truth is, they don't have the power to stop what's coming. We are the future of this company. There was an air of quiet determination in the room. Raven felt the weight of the moment, the tension in the air. A weight that would eventually lead to a breakthrough. Every conversation, every decision was another step toward building a company that was stronger, fairer, and more resilient than ever before. As the meeting drew to a close, Tanya looked at Raven with a thoughtful expression. "And what about Maria and Josh?" she asked, her voice low. Raven's lips curled into a smile, but it was cold, calculating. "They'll learn. They'll learn that no one is too big to fail. Not even the people who think they've been untouchable. And when they do, they'll understand that respect is something earned. You don't get to decide who is worthy of it." The meeting wrapped up soon after, and Raven walked out of the room feeling more certain than ever that the future was hers to shape. The resistance, the doubts, the pushback, it was all part of the process. This was the hard work. This was the grind. Raven Moore had always known that change would not come easily, but she was ready. She had spent too long on the outside looking in, watching the injustices unfold. Now, she was on the inside, calling the shots, and nothing was going to stop her. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Raven smiled, thinking back to the airport that had marked the beginning of this journey. It had all been so simple, in the end. They hadn't recognized her then. But now, there was no question. She wasn't just the new CEO. She was the force that would reshape everything, one decision, one moment, at a time.